There are moments in life when consciousness returns like dawn breaking over a battlefield, slowly, painfully, revealing devastation that was mercifully hidden by darkness. For Alpha King Calum Frostbane, awakening meant confronting not just the fire coursing through his veins from silver poisoning, but the unsettling realization that something fundamental had shifted during the hours when death had stalked him through fevered dreams. The sterile scent of antiseptic and healing herbs filled his nostrils, replacing the familiar aromas of leather, pine, and winter air that defined his world. Worse still was the alien softness pressing against his palm. Warm, gentle, entirely human. In 31 years of existence, 20 of them spent ruling through calculated distance and controlled brutality, Calum had never awakened to find his hand entwined with another's. He was a king forged in ice and necessity, shaped by betrayals that had taught him to trust no one completely and touch even less. His crown had been won through violence, maintained through fear, and secured by ensuring that warmth was a luxury he could never afford. Love was weakness. Tenderness was vulnerability. Connection was invitation to assassination. Yet here he lay, fingers intertwined with those of someone who should have been afraid to breathe in his presence, let alone hold his hand through a night when darkness had nearly claimed him forever. The soft laugh that followed his awakening carried no mockery, no fear, no calculation, only gentle amusement at something she found endearing rather than threatening. It was the sound of someone who saw past the crown to something worth protecting, past the reputation to something worth saving, and for the first time in his adult life, Alpha King Calum Frostbane discovered what it meant to be seen not as a weapon or a throne, but simply as a man who had needed an anchor in the storm. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. Consciousness returned to Calum like water slowly filling a vessel. First awareness of breathing, then the steady throb of pain that confirmed survival. Finally, the disorienting realization that he was somewhere entirely wrong for a king who had enemies circling like wolves scenting blood. The ceiling above him was plain white plaster, instead of the carved obsidian of his private chambers. Sunlight streamed through windows that faced east rather than north, casting unfamiliar shadows across walls lined with medical supplies instead of weapons. Most unsettling of all was the absence of guards' movements, or the subtle sounds that marked his fortress as a place of constant vigilance. He tried to sit up, intending to demand answers about his location and the unacceptable security breach that had placed him in such vulnerable circumstances. The movement sent lightning through his torso, forcing a sharp intake of breath that tasted of healing herbs and something else, something warm and entirely too close. "Easy," said a voice beside him, gentle but firm in its authority. "You'll tear the stitches if you move too quickly, and I'd prefer not to have my work undone by royal impatience." Calum's head turned toward the source of that unprecedented contradiction, someone giving him orders rather than taking them. What he found challenged every assumption he held about appropriate behavior in the presence of royalty. A young woman sat in a chair pulled close to his bedside, her dark brown hair caught back in a practical braid that emphasized the clean lines of her face. She wore simple gray clothing that marked her as staff rather than nobility, and her hands, currently resting atop medical charts, showed the calluses of someone accustomed to actual work. Most striking were her eyes, deep green that held steady contact with his own, without flinching or averting in submission. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice rougher than intended due to whatever had laid him low. "And where exactly am I?" "Alara Wynne," she replied matter-of-factly, head nurse of the Royal Medical Ward. "You're in the infirmary, Your Majesty? Recovering from silver poisoning and significant blood loss following the attack on your hunting party 3 days ago." The information settled like pieces of a puzzle he hadn't realized was incomplete. He remembered riding out with a small escort to survey border territories, remembered the ambush that had scattered his guards, remembered the burn of silver-tipped arrows finding their marks before darkness claimed him. What he didn't remember was how he had survived long enough to receive treatment. 3 days, he repeated, processing implications that extended beyond personal inconvenience. "My counsel, the kingdom's security during my incapacitation, all handled appropriately by Crown Prince Kieran and your senior advisors," Alara assured him, making notes on her charts with professional efficiency. "Your brother has been managing affairs while ensuring that news of your condition remained contained to prevent opportunistic uprisings." Her casual knowledge of state security matters suggested she had been briefed far beyond normal medical staff protocols, which raised questions about why a nurse would require such information. More puzzling still was the complete absence of deference in her manner. She spoke to him as she might address any patient requiring care, without the elaborate courtesy that typically marked royal interactions. "And my recovery prognosis?" Calum asked, testing whether her clinical detachment extended to delivering potentially unwelcome medical opinions. "Excellent, provided you follow instructions and avoid unnecessary strain during the healing process," Ilara replied without hesitation. "The silver was extracted successfully, and while you'll experience weakness for several weeks, there should be no permanent damage to your supernatural healing abilities." She delivered the assessment with matter-of-fact confidence that suggested extensive experience treating supernatural injuries, though he couldn't recall any human staff with such specialized knowledge working in the royal medical facilities. "How long have you served in the royal medical ward?" he asked, curiosity growing about this unexpectedly capable woman, who seemed entirely unintimidated by his presence. "6 months, Your Majesty. I was recruited from the civilian hospital in the capital, after demonstrating particular aptitude for treating supernatural physiology." Ilara glanced up from her charts to meet his eyes directly, though I should mention that your case presented some unusual challenges beyond the typical silver poisoning protocols. "Unusual how?" "You were unconscious for nearly 48 hours, which is significantly longer than normal recovery time for someone of your supernatural constitution," she explained, her tone shifting to something more personal despite maintaining professional demeanor. "During that time, your vital signs would destabilize whenever medical staff attempted to leave you alone for extended periods." Calum frowned, processing implications that made no sense according to his understanding of werewolf physiology. "Destabilize how?" "Heart rate would spike, breathing would become irregular, and your temperature would drop to dangerous levels," Ilara said carefully, as if uncertain how he would receive the information. "It took us several hours to determine the pattern, but your condition only remained stable when someone maintained physical contact with you." The revelation was deeply unsettling for reasons that extended beyond medical curiosity. Alphas, particularly alpha kings, were designed for independence and self-sufficiency. The idea that his unconscious mind had required human contact for survival contradicted everything he understood about his own nature and capabilities. "Physical contact," he repeated slowly. "What kind of physical contact?" Ilara's cheeks colored slightly, the first sign of discomfort she had displayed during their conversation. "Hand-holding proved most effective, Your Majesty. Simple skin-to-skin contact seemed to provide whatever reassurance your subconscious required for stable recovery." Memory stirred, fragments of awareness during the dark hours, impressions of warmth and steadiness that had anchored him when pain and fever threatened to drag him into permanent darkness. He had attributed such sensations to fevered imagination, but apparently they had been entirely real. And who provided this medical intervention? "The nursing staff rotated duties initially," Ilara said, her attention focused intently on her charts. "But your condition responded most positively when I maintained the contact personally, so I remained with you for the duration of the critical period." The admission hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither seemed prepared to address directly. A human nurse had spent hours holding the hand of the most powerful supernatural ruler in the known territories, providing comfort that his unconscious mind had desperately needed, but his waking pride would never have requested. The duration being approximately 36 hours of continuous contact, Your Majesty. Calum stared at her, trying to process the image of this calm, professional woman sitting beside his bed for a day and a half, holding his hand while he fought for survival. The dedication required for such commitment went far beyond normal medical duties, suggesting either extraordinary professionalism or something more personal that he wasn't prepared to examine. "That seems beyond the typical requirements of your position." "Perhaps," Ilara agreed quietly, finally looking up to meet his gaze again. "But it worked. You stabilized, the fever broke, and you're here arguing with me about medical protocols instead of dying from silver poisoning. From my perspective, that makes it entirely worthwhile." Her matter-of-fact acceptance of having potentially saved his life through such intimate care was more unsettling than gratitude or expectation of reward would have been. She spoke as if sitting with dying kings was simply another aspect of nursing that required competent handling rather than extraordinary sacrifice. "You weren't concerned about the appropriateness of such close contact with the crown?" Ilara's smile was gentle, but carried unmistakable steel. Your Majesty, when someone is dying, appropriateness becomes significantly less important than effectiveness. I've held the hands of farmers, merchants, soldiers, and nobles without regard for their social status, because human contact provides comfort that medicine alone cannot supply. I'm not human. No, she agreed. You're not. But you're still someone who was hurt, frightened, and fighting for survival. Those conditions tend to reduce everyone to the same basic needs regardless of what they become when healthy. The observation was profound in its simplicity, stripping away layers of complexity that typically surrounded royal existence to focus on fundamental human, or in his case, lupine, vulnerability. It was perspective that few people would dare offer, and fewer still would be qualified to provide. And now? Calum asked, uncertain why her answer mattered, but knowing it did. Now that I'm no longer dying and have returned to being myself, now you heal, regain your strength, and return to ruling your kingdom, Ilara replied, with the same professional competence she had maintained throughout their conversation. Though I'd recommend avoiding silver-tipped arrows in the future, as they tend to complicate otherwise routine recovery processes. Her ability to inject gentle humor into medical advice, while maintaining appropriate respect for his position, impressed him more than elaborate courtly flattery ever had. She treated him as someone capable of understanding both his own mortality and the absurdity of certain situations, recognition of intelligence that most people assumed royalty lacked. Before that, he said carefully, I believe thanks are in order, for the medical care, but particularly for the additional measures that proved necessary for my recovery. No thanks required, Your Majesty. I was doing my job. Were you? Is sitting with patients for 36-hour periods part of standard nursing protocols? Ilara was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful in ways that suggested internal debate about how much honesty was appropriate in responding to royal questions. No, she admitted finally. That was personal judgment about what seemed necessary in your specific case. Personal judgment based on what? Based on the fact that you seemed terrified when left alone, even unconscious. Your vitals indicated distress that went beyond physical pain into something that looked more like panic or abandonment fear. Her voice softened slightly. No one should have to face death alone if there's any way to prevent it. The compassion in her response was genuine and unpracticed, arising from instincts that had nothing to do with protocol or expectation of reward. She had recognized his vulnerability and responded with kindness because that was apparently who she was at her core. Someone who saw suffering and sought to alleviate it regardless of complications or personal cost, even when that someone is typically considered dangerous enough to require armed guards for protection of others. Especially then, Ilara said firmly. People who live surrounded by fear and violence probably need comfort more than anyone else, even if they can't admit it. Her insight was uncomfortably accurate, and delivered with conviction that suggested extensive thought about the psychological costs of his position. Most people saw only the power and privilege of royalty. She seemed to understand the isolation and vigilance required to maintain such authority. Before Kylum could respond to that unsettling observation, rapid footsteps in the corridor announced approaching visitors. Ilara rose immediately, checking his IV lines and ensuring his covers were properly arranged with efficiency that spoke of years managing medical emergencies. Your Majesty, she said quietly, your brother and the senior council members are coming to check on your condition. I'll leave you to handle kingdom business, but I'll be back this evening to check your progress and change your dressings. Will that be medically necessary or personal judgment? Her smile was quick and surprisingly warm, transforming her serious features in ways that made his chest tighten unexpectedly. Probably both, Your Majesty. Try not to do anything too strenuous while I'm gone. Your body is still recovering from significant trauma, regardless of how invincible you might feel. As she moved toward the door, Calum found himself reluctant to let her leave, despite the approaching demands of royal duties. Something about her presence had created calm that he hadn't experienced since childhood, a sense of safety that had nothing to do with armed protection and everything to do with genuine care from someone with no political agenda. Ilara, he called softly as she reached the door. Yes, Your Majesty? Thank you. For staying. Her expression softened into something that might have been affection, before she nodded and slipped from the room, just as Crown Prince Kieran and the senior advisors arrived to bombard him with reports and decisions requiring immediate royal attention. But throughout the lengthy briefing on border security, trade negotiations, and domestic policy matters, Calum found his thoughts returning to the woman who had held his hand through the darkest hours, and then treated such extraordinary dedication as if it were simply part of doing her job well. For the first time in his adult life, he was looking forward to medical care not because of healing it provided, but because of who would be providing it. And that realization was more unsettling than any political crisis his advisors could present. Evening brought relief from the endless stream of advisors, reports, and decisions that had filled Calum's afternoon. As shadows lengthened across the infirmary walls, the Royal Medical Ward settled into the quieter rhythms of night shift routines, soft footsteps in corridors, distant conversations about patient care, and the comforting sounds of competent people managing their responsibilities without drama or crisis. Calum found himself listening for one particular set of footsteps, with anticipation that had nothing to do with medical necessity. The painkillers Alara had administered were managing his physical discomfort effectively, and his supernatural healing was already beginning to knit damaged tissue back together. What he couldn't heal was the strange restlessness that had plagued him since awakening, a sense of incompleteness that defied rational explanation. When the familiar soft knock came at his door, followed by Alara's entrance carrying a medical supply tray, something in his chest loosened with relief that was entirely disproportionate to the situation. "Good evening, Your Majesty," she said, setting her supplies on the bedside table with practiced efficiency. "How are you feeling after your marathon council session?" "Like a man who's been reminded why I typically limit political meetings to necessary minimums," Calum replied, surprised by how easily humor came in her presence. "My advisors seem to believe that 3 days of unconsciousness should have somehow increased my patience for bureaucratic inefficiency." Alara's laugh was the same gentle sound that had greeted his awakening, genuine amusement that held no calculation or attempt to curry favor. "I'm afraid medical science hasn't yet developed treatments for political frustration, though I suspect the demand would be considerable. You'd make your fortune treating the nobility alone," he agreed, watching as she moved around his bed, checking monitors and adjusting equipment with competent grace. "Though I suspect most of them would resist admitting they needed such assistance." "People resist admitting they need help with anything important," Alara observed, pulling on fresh gloves before approaching his bandaged torso. "It's not specific to nobility, just more visible when it involves crowns and kingdoms." Her hands were steady and gentle as she began removing the dressings covering his wounds, her touch clinical, but somehow comforting in ways that professional medical care typically wasn't. Each movement was telegraphed clearly, giving him opportunity to object or tense against discomfort, though he found himself relaxing under her ministrations, instead of maintaining the hypervigilance that usually characterized his interactions with others. "These are healing remarkably well," she murmured, examining the silver burns that had nearly killed him 3 days earlier. "Your supernatural constitution is impressive even by werewolf standards." "The benefits of royal bloodline," Calum said automatically, then found himself adding more personally, "though apparently insufficient for surviving silver poisoning without external assistance." Alara glanced up from her examination, meeting his eyes with expression that carried understanding beyond mere medical knowledge. "External assistance is rarely about insufficiency, Your Majesty. Sometimes survival requires collaboration whether we're comfortable with that reality or not. Speaking from experience?" "Always," she replied simply, returning her attention to cleaning and redressing his wounds. "Human medicine wouldn't exist without collaboration between healers and patients, between different specialties, between traditional knowledge and modern techniques. No one survives alone, regardless of how much they might prefer independence." Her philosophy was delivered matter-of-factly while she worked, as if she were discussing treatment protocols rather than fundamental truths about interdependence that challenged core assumptions of alpha psychology. Calum found himself considering perspectives that would have been dismissed as weakness from anyone else. "And yet independence is generally considered essential for effective leadership," he observed, testing whether her views extended to political realities beyond medical care. "Independence and isolation aren't the same thing," Alara replied without hesitation. "Effective leaders need independence of judgment and action, but they also need accurate information from trusted sources and support systems that function when they're vulnerable. The strongest leaders I've observed were those who understood the difference." "You've observed many leaders in medical settings." more than you might expect. Injury and illness tend to humble everyone equally, regardless of their position when healthy. I've treated military commanders, merchant princes, clan leaders, and government officials, people accustomed to being in control, who suddenly found themselves dependent on others for basic survival. Calum processed this revelation, realizing that her calm competence in dealing with royal authority stemmed from extensive experience managing powerful personalities under stress. She had developed skills for handling alpha psychology that few humans would ever acquire, which explained her ability to interact with him as an individual rather than a throne. And what patterns did you observe in how such people handled dependence? Alara paused in her work, considering the question with obvious care before responding. Those who adapted well recognized that accepting help didn't diminish their authority. It demonstrated wisdom about when to delegate specialized tasks to qualified experts. Those who struggled tried to maintain control over situations where they lacked necessary knowledge or physical capability. Which category would you place me in? It's too early to tell, Your Majesty. You've been conscious for less than 12 hours and spent most of that time managing kingdom business rather than focusing on recovery. Her tone carried gentle reproof that surprised him with its directness. Though I will say that you've been remarkably cooperative with medical protocols compared to some patients I've treated. Who was less cooperative? Alpha Marcus Ironhold refused all pain medication because he considered it weakness, then passed out from agony when I tried to clean infected wounds. Lord General Harrison attempted to discharge himself against medical advice and collapsed in the corridor, requiring emergency surgery to repair damage he caused by ignoring recovery restrictions. Her examples were delivered with professional neutrality, but Calum could hear underlying frustration with patients who had prioritized pride over healing. It occurred to him that medical professionals probably developed unique perspectives on supposedly strong leaders who couldn't acknowledge their own limitations. I assume both eventually recovered? Eventually, yes, but their recoveries took significantly longer and were considerably more painful than necessary due to their resistance to accepting appropriate care. Alara finished applying fresh dressings and moved to check his IV lines. Alpha psychology often treats vulnerability as enemy rather than temporary condition requiring management. And what would you recommend for managing temporary vulnerability? Honest communication with caregivers about symptoms and concerns. Following medical advice even when it conflicts with personal preferences. Recognizing that healing requires different skills than those used for ruling kingdoms. She met his eyes directly. And understanding that needing help doesn't make you weak. It makes you someone who was hurt and is working to recover. The advice was simultaneously simple and profound, cutting through layers of conditioning that associated any form of dependence with unacceptable weakness. Hearing it from someone who had literally held his hand through life-threatening crisis gave the words weight they wouldn't have carried from others. What if the patient finds himself reluctant to return to pre-injury independence? The question emerged before Calum could fully consider its implications, revealing concerns he hadn't intended to voice. Alara's hand stilled on the IV tubing as she processed what he had essentially admitted, that he was experiencing some form of reluctance to end their therapeutic relationship. That's not uncommon, she said carefully, her tone shifting to something more gentle than clinical. Serious medical crises often create temporary psychological dependence on caregivers who provided comfort during vulnerable periods. It typically resolves naturally as patients regain strength and confidence. Typically. Yes, typically. Alara's voice carried understanding that went beyond textbook knowledge, though sometimes the dependence reflects recognition of genuine connection that extends beyond medical necessity. The admission hung between them, acknowledgement that what had developed during his unconscious hours might have evolved into something more complex than standard caregiver-patient dynamics. Neither seemed prepared to examine such implications directly, but both appeared aware that their interaction had crossed boundaries that professional relationships typically maintained. And when genuine connection exists, what happens then? That depends entirely on the individuals involved, and whether such connection can survive the transition from crisis care to normal life. Alara said quietly, "Sometimes what feels profound in medical settings dissolves when people return to their regular circumstances and responsibilities. Is that what you expect to happen here?" The question was more personal than anything he had asked since awakening, effectively requesting her assessment not just of his medical progress, but of whatever was developing between them. Alara was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing multiple considerations before responding. "I expect Your Majesty, that you'll heal completely and return to ruling your kingdom with all the strength and authority you possessed before the attack," she said finally. "What I hope is that the experience might have provided perspective that proves valuable for future leadership decisions." Her response was diplomatically neutral, while avoiding direct answer to his more personal question. But something in her tone suggested that she was as uncertain about their evolving dynamic as he was, despite her professional experience with similar situations. "And what about what you hope for yourself? What perspective has this experience provided for your future?" "I've learned that even the most powerful people sometimes need simple human comfort," Ilara replied honestly, "and that providing such comfort, even to those who seem completely self-sufficient, can be more rewarding than I expected." The confession was quietly delivered, but carried emotional weight that suggested her involvement in his care had affected her as profoundly as it had him. They were both discovering that extraordinary circumstances could create connections that transcended normal social boundaries and professional protocols. Before either could explore such implications further, commotion in the corridor announced unexpected late-night visitors. Ilara immediately moved to the window, peering through the partially closed blinds with expression that shifted from curiosity to concern. "Your Majesty," she said quietly, "there are vehicles arriving with what appears to be emergency delegation. Multiple military escorts, formal banners, something that requires immediate royal attention." Calum pushed himself upright despite protests from healing wounds, recognizing that crisis rarely respected convenient timing for recovery. "Help me sit up properly. Whatever's happening, I can't address it from a prone position. You should be resting. I should be available when my kingdom faces emergencies," he corrected firmly, but not unkindly. "But I'll need assistance managing the physical requirements while maintaining appropriate royal presence." Ilara hesitated only briefly before moving to adjust his bed positioning and arrange pillows to support him in dignified upright posture. Her hands were efficient but gentle, ensuring his comfort, while understanding the political necessity of appearing strong before unexpected visitors. "Thank you," he said quietly as she finished the adjustments, "for understanding that sometimes duty requires pushing beyond medical recommendations. Just promise me you'll rest immediately afterward," she replied, genuine concern evident in her voice. "Your body is still healing from significant trauma, regardless of how important kingdom business might be. I promise." The simple exchange felt remarkably intimate despite its practical nature. Personal care that acknowledged both his royal responsibilities and her genuine worry about his well-being. They had found balance between professional duty and personal concern that neither had experienced before. Heavy footsteps approached the door, accompanied by the formal announcement that preceded important diplomatic arrivals. As Ilara moved to admit the visitors while ensuring medical equipment was properly positioned, Calum found himself drawing strength from her presence in ways that had nothing to do with physical treatment. Whatever crisis awaited, he would face it with the confidence of someone who had survived near death through the dedication of someone who genuinely cared about his welfare. It was foundation he had never possessed before, and one he was increasingly reluctant to surrender when his recovery ended. Crown Prince Kieran entered first, his expression grim in ways that indicated the emergency was significant. Behind him came Lord Commander Harrison and several senior advisors whose late-night presence confirmed the situation's seriousness. "Your Majesty," Kieran began without preamble, "we've received intelligence about coordinated attacks planned against 3 border territories. The perpetrators appear to be the same faction responsible for your assassination attempt, and they're moving more quickly than our security assessments predicted." As his brother detailed the threat analysis and requested immediate strategic decisions, Calum found his attention split between crucial kingdom defense and awareness of Ilara quietly monitoring his condition from the room's periphery. Her presence provided calm that allowed him to process complex information without the anxiety that typically accompanied major military crises. For the first time in his reign, he was facing potential warfare with the support of someone whose concern was purely personal, rather than political. It was luxury he had never imagined possible, and one that transformed his entire approach to leadership pressure. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he no longer faced them alone. 2 weeks later, Calum stood before the great windows of his private study, watching dawn break over territories that had been secured through swift military action and careful diplomatic maneuvering. The coordinated attacks had been thwarted, the responsible factions neutralized, and stability restored to regions that had briefly teetered on the edge of open rebellion. By all measurable standards, the crisis had been managed with exemplary efficiency. His advisors were satisfied, his military commanders confident, and his people safe from threats that could have devastated multiple communities. Yet despite these successes, Calum found himself struggling with a restlessness that had nothing to do with kingdom security, and everything to do with the woman who had quietly transformed his understanding of strength and vulnerability. Alara had been officially discharged from his medical care 5 days ago, when his wounds had healed sufficiently to no longer require professional monitoring. Their final appointment had been cordial, professional, and absolutely devastating in its careful maintenance of appropriate boundaries. She had checked his healing progress, provided instructions for continued recovery, and wished him well with the polite formality of a nurse completing successful treatment of an important patient. What she hadn't done was acknowledge that they had developed something that transcended medical necessity, or indicate any interest in continuing their connection outside the context of his recovery. Her competent professionalism had effectively ended whatever had grown between them during the weeks when she had been essential to his well-being. The rational part of his mind recognized this as appropriate and probably wise. Kings who became emotionally involved with human staff members created complications that rarely ended well for anyone involved. Their difference in status made any genuine relationship politically impossible, while the intense circumstances of their meeting made it difficult to assess whether their connection could survive normal interaction patterns. But rationality offered little comfort when he found himself listening for footsteps that no longer had reason to approach his chambers, or when he caught himself creating excuses to visit the medical ward in hopes of glimpsing the woman who had held his hand through the darkest hours of his life. A soft knock at his study door interrupted his brooding thoughts. "Enter," he called, expecting one of his advisors with the morning reports that structured his daily routines. Instead, Crown Prince Kieran stepped into the room with expression that indicated personal rather than official business. "Good morning, brother. You look remarkably well rested for someone who's been staring out windows since before dawn." "I've been reviewing territorial reports," Calum lied smoothly, though they both knew no documents were visible on his desk. "The border situations require continued monitoring despite recent security improvements." "Naturally," Kieran agreed with tone that suggested complete disbelief in such explanations. "Though I'm curious whether these territorial concerns involve any medical facilities that might require personal royal inspection." The observation was delivered with gentle mockery that indicated Calum's recent visits to the infirmary had not gone unnoticed by palace staff. His brother's diplomatic manner couldn't quite disguise amusement at witnessing behavior that contradicted everything they had previously known about royal romantic inclinations. "I'm ensuring that medical services remain adequate for treating supernatural injuries," Calum replied with dignity that would have been more convincing if he hadn't made 3 such inspections in the past week. "Recent events highlighted potential gaps in our healthcare preparedness." "Ah yes, healthcare preparedness. Very important." Kieran moved to pour himself coffee from the service set near the study's fireplace, his movements casual in ways that indicated extended conversation rather than brief update. "Though I have to admit, I'm impressed by your sudden interest in nursing staff qualifications and training protocols. Professional competence in medical care directly affects kingdom security." "Absolutely. In fact, I've been thinking we should probably expand our medical recruitment efforts, particularly for specialists who demonstrate exceptional skill with supernatural physiology." Kieran settled into one of the leather chairs facing the windows, his expression innocently thoughtful. "Perhaps we should offer additional incentives to retain talented personnel who might otherwise seek opportunities elsewhere." Calum turned from the window to study his brother's face, recognizing the careful way Kieran was approaching a topic he clearly considered important. "What kind of incentives are you suggesting?" "Well, I've heard that Nurse Wynne has received several offers from other medical facilities throughout the kingdom. Apparently, her reputation for treating complex supernatural cases has spread considerably following recent events." The news hit Calum like a physical blow, though he struggled to maintain neutral expression while processing implications he hadn't considered. Of course, other facilities would want to recruit someone with Alara's demonstrated expertise. Her successful treatment of royal silver poisoning would have established credentials that any supernatural medical facility would value highly. "What kind of offers?" he asked, proud that his voice remained steady despite the sudden tightness in his chest. "Position as head of supernatural emergency services at the capital civilian hospital, significant salary increase, expanded authority, opportunity to train other staff in advanced treatment protocols. Kieran's tone was carefully neutral, but his eyes held understanding of how such news would affect his brother. She's scheduled to meet with their administrators this afternoon to discuss terms. I see. Caleb returned his attention to the window, processing the realization that Alara might disappear from his life entirely through career advancement rather than simple completion of medical duties. When would such a position begin? Immediately, if she accepts. They're apparently quite eager to secure her services before other facilities make competing offers. The conversation continued around details of medical staffing and recruitment policies, but Caleb found his attention focused entirely on the possibility that he might never see Alara again. The prospect created a hollow ache in his chest that had nothing to do with physical healing and everything to do with emotional attachment he had been reluctant to acknowledge. When Kieran finally departed with promises to monitor healthcare staffing issues, Caleb remained at the window contemplating choices that seemed simultaneously obvious and impossible. He could allow Alara to accept the new position and move forward with his life, as if their weeks together had been merely successful medical treatment. Or he could acknowledge that what had developed between them was worth exploring despite political complications and social impossibilities. The decision crystallized with startling clarity, as he realized that losing her would leave him diminished in ways that had nothing to do with royal authority or political power. She had shown him what it meant to be cared for without agenda, supported without expectation of reward, and valued for himself rather than his crown. Such connections were rare enough in any life. For someone in his position, they were essentially miraculous. An hour later, Caleb walked through the corridors leading to the medical ward, with purpose that had attracted attention from guards and staff members unaccustomed to seeing their king in areas typically managed by others. His destination was clear, though he hadn't fully determined what he intended to say when he reached it. The medical ward's familiar antiseptic scents and quiet efficiency welcomed him with associations that were entirely positive, despite the circumstances that had first brought him there. Staff members offered respectful acknowledgments of his presence while continuing their duties with professional competence that he had learned to appreciate during his recovery. He found Alara in one of the small offices used by senior medical personnel, reviewing patient charts with concentration that reminded him of her careful attention to his own care. She looked up when his shadow fell across her workspace, and her expression shifted through surprise, professional courtesy, and something warmer that she quickly controlled. "Your Majesty," she said, rising to offer appropriate respect, despite obvious questions about his unexpected appearance. "I hope you're not experiencing any complications with your recovery. My physical recovery is complete, thanks to your excellent care," Caleb replied, studying her face for signs of the connection he hoped might still exist beneath professional politeness. "I'm here on a different matter entirely. How can I assist you? I understand you've received offers for advancement to other medical facilities." Alara's expression became more guarded, though whether from surprise at his knowledge or uncertainty about his motivations remained unclear. "I have received some opportunities for career development." "Yes. And are you planning to accept any of these offers?" "I'm considering my options, Your Majesty. The position at the civilian hospital would provide significant professional growth opportunities that aren't available in my current role." Her diplomatic response revealed nothing about personal preferences, while acknowledging the practical advantages of career advancement. But something in her tone suggested the decision wasn't as straightforward as pure professional calculation might dictate. "What factors are influencing your consideration?" Alara was quiet for a moment, clearly debating how much honesty was appropriate when discussing career decisions with the king, whose medical care had created whatever opportunities she was now evaluating. "The new position offers chance to expand treatment protocols for supernatural injuries and train other medical personnel in advanced care techniques," she said finally. "It's exactly the kind of work I hoped to do when I specialized in supernatural medicine. But it would mean leaving behind familiarity with current colleagues and established working relationships that have proven effective." The careful phrasing suggested personal considerations that she wasn't comfortable discussing directly, but which were clearly significant factors in her decision-making process. Caleb recognized the diplomatic language of someone trying to acknowledge feelings without creating inappropriate complications. "Alara," he said quietly, using her first name for only the second time since awakening in her care. "May I speak with you privately about a matter that extends beyond your career considerations?" Her eyes widened slightly at the shift to personal address and the implications of private conversation with royal authority. "Of course, Your Majesty." Caleb moved to close the office door, ensuring they wouldn't be interrupted or overheard during what he hoped would be honest discussion about possibilities neither had been willing to explore while maintaining professional boundaries. "The matter I need to discuss," he said, turning to face her directly, "is that during the past 2 weeks, I've discovered that your absence from my daily routine has created difficulties that have nothing to do with medical care. Difficulties? I find myself listening for your footsteps in corridors where you have no reason to walk. I create excuses to visit medical facilities in hopes of glimpsing someone who provided comfort I didn't know I needed until I no longer had access to it." He paused, gathering courage for complete honesty. What developed between us during my recovery was not merely successful medical treatment, and pretending otherwise has become impossible. Alara's intake of breath was sharp enough to be audible, her hands gripping the edge of her desk as she processed his admission. "Your Majesty, whatever connection we developed was created by extraordinary circumstances that don't reflect normal, don't they?" Calum interrupted gently. "Because what I remember from those weeks is someone who saw past the crown to recognize vulnerability that needed tending. Someone who provided comfort without agenda and care without expectation of reward. Those aren't circumstances, Alara. Those are character traits that wouldn't change regardless of setting. But the practical realities are that I'm 31 years old and have never experienced genuine affection from someone who wanted nothing from me except my recovery and well-being," he continued, moving closer despite her obvious uncertainty. "The practical realities are that you transformed my understanding of strength and weakness, of independence and connection, in ways that have made me a better leader and a better man." Tears gathered in Alara's eyes as she struggled with emotions that were clearly as complex as his own. "The practical realities are also that I'm a human nurse whose relationship with the Alpha King would create political complications that could destroy both our lives. Or," Calum said softly, "the practical realities could include new traditions that value merit over bloodline and personal worth over social status. The practical realities could include a king who's strong enough to choose his own partner based on genuine connection rather than political convenience. You're talking about changing fundamental aspects of how royal relationships function. I'm talking about choosing happiness over convenience and love over politics," he corrected. "I'm talking about recognizing that the woman who held my hand through the darkest hours of my life might be exactly the person I want beside me for all the bright ones ahead." The declaration hung between them like bridge spanning impossible distance, offering connection that could transform both their lives while acknowledging the courage required to cross such dangerous territory. "Calum," Alara whispered, using his given name for the first time since they had met. "What you're suggesting would require sacrificing security and certainty for something that might not survive the pressures of royal life. What I'm suggesting would require trusting that what we built during extraordinary circumstances is strong enough to survive ordinary ones," he replied, reaching out to take her hands in his. "What I'm suggesting is choosing love over fear." Alara looked down at their joined hands, his large and scarred from years of combat and leadership, hers smaller but equally strong from years of healing work, and seemed to find something in their connection that answered questions she hadn't known how to ask. "The position at the civilian hospital," she said quietly, "can wait, or can be declined, or can be redefined as needed," Calum assured her. "But the opportunity for us to discover what we might become together, that's available right now, if you're brave enough to take it." When Alara looked up to meet his eyes, her expression held wonder, mixed with determination that suggested she had found the courage he was hoping for. "I've spent years taking care of other people," she said softly. "I think I'm ready to see what it feels like to be taken care of in return." Calum's smile was the most genuine expression of joy he could remember experiencing, reflecting happiness that came not from conquest or achievement, but from recognition of love freely given and gratefully received. "In that case," he said, bringing her hands to his lips for gentle kisses that sealed promises they were both ready to make, "we should probably discuss how a king's nurse becomes a king's partner, and how two people who found each other in the darkest circumstances can build something beautiful in the light." 3 months later, the Royal Gardens hosted a celebration that redefined everyone's understanding of appropriate royal ceremony. Queen Alara's coronation had been planned with unprecedented inclusivity, welcoming medical professionals, civilian representatives, and common citizens alongside traditional nobility to witness the elevation of someone chosen for character rather than bloodline. The ceremony itself honored both their individual paths and their shared future, acknowledging her contributions to medical advancement alongside her new role in royal leadership, recognizing his evolution from solitary authority to partnership-based rule. As they stood together before assembled witnesses from every level of society, Calum reflected on how profoundly his life had changed since awakening to find his hand held by someone brave enough to provide comfort without permission and strong enough to challenge conventional wisdom about power and connection. "Any regrets?" Alara asked quietly, as they acknowledged the cheers and celebrations of people who had come to honor their unlikely love story. "Only that it took nearly dying to find you," he replied, squeezing the hand that had anchored him through darkness and now promised to share every light ahead. "Well," she said with the gentle laugh he had learned to treasure above any sound in the world, "I suppose some discoveries are worth the extraordinary circumstances required to make them possible." As they moved together through crowds of well-wishers toward a future built on mutual care rather than political necessity, both knew they had found something rare and precious: love that had survived scrutiny, partnership that honored both independence and interdependence, and strength that came not from standing alone, but from choosing to stand together. The Alpha King, who had once trusted no one completely, had learned that the right hand to hold could provide security that no amount of power could purchase. And the nurse, who had spent years caring for others, had discovered that sometimes the greatest healing comes from allowing oneself to be loved in return. In the end, they had both learned that the most profound transformations often begin with the simplest acts of kindness, and that holding someone's hand through darkness can illuminate possibilities neither could have imagined while standing alone. Epilogue. 5 years later, the soft autumn light filtering through the nursery windows cast a golden glow over the scene that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. Alpha King Calum Frostbane sitting cross-legged on the floor, carefully bandaging the scraped knee of a 3-year-old who had inherited both his mother's stubborn independence and his father's tendency to take on Chol, enges beyond his current capabilities. "There we go, little warrior," Calum murmured to Prince Adrian, whose tears had stopped the moment his father began the careful process of cleaning and dressing his injury. "All better, though perhaps climbing the garden oak might be an adventure to attempt when you're a bit taller." "Mama says healing is just as brave as fighting," Adrian declared with the absolute certainty of childhood, examining his bandaged knee with obvious pride. "And that taking care of people is the most important job anyone can do." "Your mama is exceptionally wise," Calum agreed, glancing toward the doorway where Queen Alara stood watching their interaction with the gentle smile that still had the power to transform his entire day. "She's taught both of us quite a lot about what real strength looks like." Alara approached with 18-month-old Princess Liana balanced on her hip, the baby's curious green eyes, so like her mother's, taking in every detail of her brother's medical treatment with fascination that suggested she might follow the family tradition of interest in healing arts. "How's our patient?" Alara asked, settling beside them on the nursery rug, with the easy grace of someone who had learned to balance royal dignity with the practical demands of motherhood. "Brave, as always," Calum replied, pressing a gentle kiss to Adrian's forehead before helping him down from the window seat where the impromptu medical treatment had taken place. "Though I suspect he gets that from his mother, rather than his father. I think bravery comes from both sides of this family," Alara said diplomatically, though her eyes held the warmth that always appeared when she watched Calum interact with their children. After all, it takes considerable courage to revolutionize kingdom governance while learning to change diapers simultaneously. The past 5 years had indeed brought changes that extended far beyond their personal lives. The constitutional reforms they had championed together, expanding representation to include civilian voices, establishing merit-based advancement opportunities, and creating social programs that addressed healthcare and education across all population segments, had transformed their kingdom into something approaching the egalitarian society Alara had always believed was possible. The process hadn't been without challenges. Several traditional noble families had initially resisted policies that diminished inherited privilege in favor of demonstrated capability. 2 assassination attempts had required enhanced security protocols that sometimes felt like steps backward from the accessibility they were trying to achieve. Political opposition from neighboring territories had necessitated careful diplomatic maneuvering to prevent ideological differences from escalating into military conflicts, but the results spoke for themselves. Their kingdom had achieved prosperity levels unprecedented in regional history, with economic growth driven by innovations from previously marginalized populations who now had opportunities to contribute their talents. Medical advances pioneered by their expanded healthcare system were being adopted throughout the supernatural world. Educational initiatives that included both human and werewolf children together had created a generation that would grow up seeing cooperation as natural rather than revolutionary. "Speaking of kingdom governance," Alara said, shifting Lyanna to a more comfortable position as the baby reached for her father with the confident expectation of immediate attention. "Lord Commander Harrison requested audience this afternoon about the delegation from the Eastern Territories. Apparently, our constitutional model is generating significant interest among progressive factions in their political structure." Calum accepted his daughter with practiced ease, marveling as he always did at how completely natural fatherhood had become despite his initial concerns about bringing children into the dangerous world of royal politics. Both Adrian and Lyanna had inherited supernatural strength that would protect them from many threats, but more importantly, they were growing up in a kingdom that valued their individual worth rather than simply their bloodline significance. "What kind of interest?" he asked, settling Lyanna on his lap, while Adrian busied himself arranging his medical supplies in careful imitation of his mother's professional organization. "The kind that might lead to formal alliance discussions if we handle the diplomatic aspects carefully," Alara replied, with the political sophistication that had made her an invaluable partner in governance as well as life. Though Lord Commander Harrison seemed to think their primary motivation involves replicating our healthcare integration policies rather than broader constitutional reforms. Reasonable starting point. Healthcare cooperation tends to create foundation for other collaborative initiatives without triggering territorial sovereignty concerns. Their conversation was interrupted by Adrian's excited announcement that he had successfully organized all the medical supplies, just like Mama does in the real hospital, and was ready to practice healing people if anyone needed treatment. "Actually," Alara said thoughtfully, "I think your papa might benefit from some therapeutic attention. He's been working too many late hours on trade negotiations, and professional medical opinion suggests he needs more rest." Adrian immediately turned his serious attention to examining his father, with the intense focus he applied to all important tasks. "Papa, do you have OEs from working too much?" "He's from perhaps a few tired muscles," Calum admitted, playing along with the game while genuinely appreciating how their children were learning to associate healthcare with caring attention, rather than crisis intervention. "What would Dr. Adrian recommend for such symptoms?" "Hugs," Adrian declared without hesitation. "And maybe stories. And definitely no more work until tomorrow." "Excellent diagnosis," Alara agreed solemnly. "I concur completely with Dr. Adrian's treatment plan." As their son climbed onto Calum's other knee to administer prescribed hugs, while Lyanna contentedly played with her father's fingers, Calum reflected on how perfectly his family had learned to balance royal responsibilities with personal relationships. They were raising children who understood both privilege and responsibility, who saw service as opportunity rather than burden, and who would hopefully carry forward the values that had transformed their kingdom into something worth inheriting. "You know," he said quietly to Alara, as their children settled into the comfortable routine of afternoon family time, "sometimes I still find it difficult to believe this is real. That someone who began as my nurse became my partner in reshaping an entire political system. Sometimes I find it difficult to believe that someone who began as the most feared alpha king became someone who spends Saturday afternoons playing doctor with his children," Alara replied with gentle humor. "Though I have to admit, both transformations seem to have worked out remarkably well." "Any regrets about the civilian hospital position you never accepted?" "The career advancement opportunities you sacrificed for royal politics and motherhood? None whatsoever," Alara said with immediate certainty. "Though I do appreciate that our healthcare initiatives have created opportunities for other medical professionals to advance based on merit rather than connections. Sometimes the best way to open doors for yourself is to prop them open for everyone else." As evening shadows lengthened across the nursery and their children's energy began transitioning toward bedtime routines, Calum considered how completely his understanding of strength and vulnerability had evolved since awakening to find his hand held by someone brave enough to provide care without permission. He had learned that accepting help didn't diminish authority, but enhanced it through broader perspective and deeper connection. He had discovered that the strongest leaders were those who surrounded themselves with people whose capabilities complemented their own weaknesses. Most importantly, He had realized that love freely given and gratefully received created foundation for achievements that solitary power could never accomplish. "Papa," Adrian said sleepily as Calum carried him toward his bedroom for the evening routine, "when I grow up, can I be a healer like Mama and a king like you?" "You can be anything you choose to be," Calum assured him, meaning every word. "Though I suspect you'll find ways to be both those things and several others we haven't thought of yet. And can I marry someone who holds my hand when I'm scared?" The question was innocent, but profound, reflecting lessons about partnership and support that their children were absorbing through daily example, rather than formal instruction. "I hope you do," Calum replied, meeting Alara's eyes over their son's head, with smile that acknowledged how completely their love story had become foundation for everything they were building together. The very best adventures are shared with people who care enough to stay beside you through both dark times and bright ones. Later that evening, after children were settled and kingdom business was completed, Calum and Alara found themselves in their private study reviewing the day's events and planning for challenges that tomorrow would bring. It was routine they had developed during their early months together and maintained through years of growth and change. Quiet time for connection and conversation that kept their partnership strong, despite the demands of royal responsibilities and family obligations. Lord Commander Harrison was right about the Eastern Territory delegation's motivations, Alara said, reviewing diplomatic reports while curled against Calum's side on the sofa that had become their favorite spot for evening discussions. "Their healthcare infrastructure has significant gaps that our integration model could address effectively. And the political implications of providing such assistance? Primarily positive, provided we structure agreements to respect their sovereignty while sharing knowledge and resources," she replied thoughtfully. "Though we'll need to be careful about creating precedents that other territories might interpret as attempts to expand influence through humanitarian aid." Their conversation continued through analysis of domestic policy initiatives, international relations, and the ongoing challenges of governing a kingdom in transition. But underneath practical discussions ran deeper current of gratitude for partnership that enhanced both their individual capabilities and their shared vision for creating positive change. "Calum," Alara said softly as they prepared to retire for the evening, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been injured that day? If we had never met under those extraordinary circumstances?" "I try not to think about that possibility too often," he admitted, drawing her closer as they settled into bed together. "Because I can't imagine any scenario where I would have been wise enough to recognize your worth without being forced into vulnerability that required your care. Perhaps we would have found each other eventually through different circumstances. Perhaps, but I'm grateful we don't have to test that theory." Calum pressed a gentle kiss to her temple, breathing in the familiar scent that had become synonymous with home and happiness. "I'm grateful for silver arrows and stubborn nurses, and the miraculous discovery that the strongest foundation for a kingdom is love freely given and joyfully received." As they drifted toward sleep in the comfortable intimacy of marriage that had been tested by public scrutiny and strengthened by shared purpose, both knew they had created something extraordinary, not just personal happiness, but political transformation that would benefit generations yet to come. The Alpha King who had once trusted no one completely had learned that opening his heart created strength rather than weakness. The nurse who had spent years caring for others had discovered that accepting love in return multiplied rather than diminished her capacity to help heal the world. Together, they had proven that the most profound changes often begin with simple acts of kindness, that holding someone's hand through darkness can illuminate possibilities neither could imagine alone, and that love strong enough to transform individuals can become foundation for reshaping entire societies. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the kingdom slept peacefully under their protection, and their children dreamed of futures bright with possibility, Calum and Alara held each other close and knew they had found the greatest treasure any ruler could possess: partnership built on trust, love proven through service, and the unshakable certainty that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together. The hand that had steadied him through near death had become the hand that guided him through life, and the heart that had opened to provide comfort had become the heart that shared every joy and sorrow the future would hold. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.